we will use 6 rows and 7 columns. So we will initialize that the size of row is 6 and column is 7. As for the piece that will be used, we will use this. Static final char, empty slot, equals slash. This one is the cells when it is empty. Static final char, your piece, equal x, a piece for human player. Static final char, computer piece, equals 0, a piece for computer. Then we declare a two-dimensional array. We will now create a main method that will function as the gate throughout their methods. We will use dual loop to organize our UI. This will ask the user to enter 1 or 2. This will be used later in a switch case statement. We will create a switch statement that will function of what will be the user inputs, whether it will be 1 or 2. And if the user chooses an invalid number, the user will be redirected to the start. And if 1, the user will be redirected to the code block that will run the game. And if 2, the user will exit the program. If the user chooses 1, then the user will be play game, redirected to the play game method that will later create. As long as the player don't choose to, the code will continue. We will now initialize the board.
Printing the board. We will use a nested loop again to print our board. We will now create the method of the logic of the game. Type the method that we used to initialize the board. Create a scanner that will read the user's input. We will use a boolean to declare variables so we can stop the loop when the players wins, losses, or when the board are full and ends up in a draw. We will use a while loop that will only stop when someone wins or the board is full. Print board will print the board that we created earlier. We will now create a logic when it's the human player's turn.
Of course, we need to first to ask the user to enter the columns or cells he wants to enter his move. Don't forget to enter -1 at the end of your scanner because the array starts at 0, not 1. Use an if-else statement to make sure that the user will enter valid input. The logic for the user input, we will discuss it further later.
Another conditional statement will be used to check whether the player wins, and if not, the game will continue. The same code logic will be used, but the only difference is we will not ask the user for the input, rather it will become random input. We will now create a method for the computer to automatically input a value for each turn. We use math.random plus parentheses asterisk max minus min plus 1 to generate a random floating point number between 0 inclusive and max minus min plus 1 exclusive. Int will cast the generated floating point number to an integer, truncating the decimal part. We will now create a method to check whether the user inputs a valid move. Next is method to check whether the board is full or not.
Loop to iterate through each row and columns of the game board. Inside the loops, check if the current cell of the board contains an empty slot.
If an empty slot is found during the iteration, immediately return false. This indicates that the board is not full. If the method reaches this point, it means no empty slots were found during the iteration. In this case, return true, indicating that the entire board is full. Lastly, we will create a method to check if someone already win the game. We will use a nested loop to iterate through each row and column. checking for consecutive pieces horizontally. Now, we create a checker if four consecutive cells in the same row have a specified game piece. Almost the same code will be used, but the conditions for rows and columns will swap. This was used to check for consecutive pieces vertically. Same code, but this time both the rows and columns have the same logic as the rows before. This was used to check for consecutive pieces diagonally from top left to bottom right. Again, same code will be used, and this time the columns logic will be this. For integer call equals columns minus 1 semicolon call greater than or equal to 3 semicolon call decrement. To check for consecutive pieces diagonally from top right to bottom left. If neither of the winning conditions doesn't return true, then the code will continue to ask the user and computer to input their move.